Mark spent 15 years turning an abandoned ranch into the peaceful home he had always dreamed of. Then everything changed the day the new HOA president, Linda, bought the mansion next door. Without permission, she built a luxury resort-style swimming pool directly along their shared property line, complete with loud parties, floodlights, and guests staring into Mark's backyard every weekend. She thought money and influence made her untouchable. She never expected Mark to respond with lawsuits or angry confrontations. Instead, he quietly built something 5 feet away that turned her expensive paradise into the neighborhood's most infamous nightmare. Mark Whitfield was 46 years old, a retired construction engineer who had spent most of his career designing bridges and drainage systems for a firm that valued precision over personality. When he finally walked away from that world, he did not dream of travel or leisure. He dreamed of quiet. He wanted a piece of land where the only sounds were wind through leaves and water moving over stone, and he found that piece of land on the edge of a sleepy American town, a neglected ranch property that most buyers had passed over because the house needed work and the fences had rotted through. Mark saw something different. He saw potential in every warped board and every overgrown field, and over the course of 15 years he rebuilt the place piece by piece with his own hands. He planted rows of maple and oak along the property borders, trees that had grown tall enough now to shade the entire back half of his land. He dug a small pond and stocked it with koi, watching them glide beneath the surface on summer evenings with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He built a vegetable garden that fed him through most of the year, tomatoes and squash and beans growing in neat, deliberate rows, the way everything in his life tended to grow, slow and careful and permanent. He replaced the old fencing with cedar panels he cut and stained himself, sanding every edge until it was smooth enough to run a bare hand along without splinters. Neighbors who passed by often slowed their cars just to look at what he had done, and more than one person told him his property looked like something out of a magazine. Mark had never married, and though a few people in town occasionally speculated about that fact, the truth was simpler than any of their guesses. He had spent most of his younger years moving from job site to job site, chasing contracts across several states, sleeping in rented rooms and temporary trailers, while other men his age were settling down and raising families. By the time he had saved enough to buy his own land and stop chasing the next paycheck, he had grown so accustomed to solitude that it no longer felt like something missing from his life. It felt, instead, like something he had earned. The ranch became his family in a way. Each tree and fence posed a marker of years spent building instead of wandering, and he tended to it with the same devotion another man might give to a marriage or a household full of children. His days followed a rhythm that rarely changed. He woke early, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, and walked the perimeter of his property with a mug of black coffee, checking the fences, inspecting the garden beds, listening for anything out of place. He fixed what needed fixing himself, whether that meant replacing a warped board or clearing a clogged drainage line, skills left over from decades spent solving exactly those kinds of problems for other people's projects. In the evenings, he sat on his porch and watched the koi pond catch the last light of the day, and more often than not, that was the entire shape of his happiness. Nothing more complicated than quiet hours spent on land that belonged entirely to him. What Mark loved most about the life he had built was not the garden or the pond or the fences, it was the silence. He was not a man who enjoyed conflict. He avoided confrontation the way other people avoided storms, stepping carefully around anything that threatened to turn into an argument. He had never filed a lawsuit in his life, and had no interest in starting now. He did not want trouble with anyone, and for a long time, trouble never found him. The family who had lived in the mansion next door before Linda arrived had been kind, quiet people who kept to themselves and waved politely whenever their paths crossed his. They had lived there for over a decade, raising 2 children who were now grown and gone, and in all that time not a single disagreement had ever passed between the 2 households. Mark's world was calm, ordered, and exactly the way he wanted it, and he had, perhaps naively, assumed it would remain that way indefinitely. Then, one autumn, a moving truck rolled up the long driveway of the mansion next door, and everything Mark had built began to change. Linda Radford was 52 years old when she moved into the neighborhood, and within a matter of months she had positioned herself as the president of the Homeowners Association, a role she seemed to have been preparing for her entire life. She was polished in the way that money makes people polished, dressed in clothes that looked casual but cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, driving a car that gleamed even after a week of rain. She had a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like a decision that had already been made, and she carried herself with the certainty of someone who had never once been told no and meant it. Before arriving in town, Linda had built a career out of real estate development, buying struggling properties, renovating them quickly, and selling them at a profit to buyers who wanted the appearance of luxury without the patience to build it themselves. It was a career that rewarded speed, confidence, and a certain ruthlessness toward anyone standing between her and a closed deal, qualities she carried with her long after she stepped away from the business and settled into the mansion she had purchased outright with cash. She had chosen the neighborhood specifically because it seemed, to her, like fertile ground for exactly the kind of influence she enjoyed wielding, a quiet community with an underfunded association and residents who, in her estimation, had never been properly organized. Within weeks of her arrival, she had already identified the association presidency as vacant in spirit if not in title, and she moved to claim it with the same efficiency she once applied to closing on undervalued houses. The other members of the association board welcomed her eagerly. She spoke confidently at meetings, proposed initiatives that sounded impressive, even when they amounted to little more than cosmetic guidelines, and offered to personally fund several small community projects, a gesture that won her immediate goodwill among neighbors who had grown tired of years of stagnant leadership. Within 2 months of moving in, Linda held the presidency, a title she treated less like a community responsibility and more like a personal mandate to reshape the neighborhood according to her own taste. On her first afternoon in the neighborhood, Linda walked over to introduce herself to Mark, and at first he thought it was simply a friendly gesture, the kind of welcome any new neighbor might offer. He was wrong. Tucked under her arm was a folder, thick with printed pages, and before Mark had finished offering her a glass of lemonade, she was already reading from a list. She told him his fence looked outdated and needed to be replaced with something more modern. She told him his trees had grown too tall and were, in her words, blocking the aesthetic flow of the street. She told him his garden shed was an eyesore and that the color of his roof did not match the palette the association was hoping to establish going forward. Mark listened patiently, the way he listened to most things, and when she finished, he simply said, "I'll take a look at it." It was not a yes, and it was not the enthusiastic agreement Linda seemed to expect. She was a woman used to people falling in line the moment she spoke, and Mark's calm, non-committal response left a visible flicker of irritation on her face before she smiled tightly and walked back toward her own property. For a few weeks, nothing happened, and Mark allowed himself to believe the encounter had been nothing more than an overzealous introduction. Then the construction trucks arrived. They came in a steady stream, day after day, heavy machinery rumbling up Linda's driveway and workers unloading pallets of stone, tile, and steel. Mark watched from his porch as the project took shape, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. Linda was not simply renovating her backyard. She was building an enormous resort-style swimming pool, and she was building it directly along the property line the two homes shared, close enough that Mark could have tossed a stone from his porch and landed it in the water. The pool, once finished, was the kind of structure that belonged behind a hotel rather than a private home. It curved in a long, dramatic shape with a raised spa at one end and a sunken lounge area with underwater seating at the other. Outdoor speakers were mounted along the perimeter, wired into a sound system powerful enough to be heard blocks away. A small stage had been built near the deep end, presumably for a DJ or a live performer, and beside it stood a fully stocked outdoor bar with a marble countertop that caught the sunlight like glass. At the far corner, water tumbled over an artificial rock formation designed to look like a waterfall, though the constant rush of water only added to the noise that would soon become a permanent fixture of Mark's life. The parties began almost immediately, and they did not stop. Every weekend, sometimes on weeknights as well, cars lined the street outside Linda's mansion, and guests poured through her gates in numbers that seemed to grow larger each time. Music thumped against Mark's windows late into the night, bass lines rattling the glass panes he had installed himself years earlier. Floodlights positioned around the pool blazed so brightly that Mark's entire backyard, the garden he had tended for 15 years, was washed in artificial light until well past midnight. Laughter and shouting carried easily across the short distance between the two properties. And more than once, Mark stepped outside to find strangers standing at the fence line, drinks in hand, peering directly into his yard as though it were part of the entertainment. Some of Linda's guests treated his property like an extension of the party. They took photographs of his koi pond. They commented loudly on his garden, sometimes admiring it, sometimes mocking the idea that anyone would spend so much effort on vegetables when they could simply buy them at a store. A few, emboldened by alcohol, leaned over the fence to get a closer look, and one man went so far as to toss an empty cup over the cedar panels Mark had built with his own hands, letting it land somewhere among his tomato plants. The nights were the hardest part for Mark. He had spent 15 years learning the particular quality of silence that settled over his land after sunset, the way sound traveled differently once the crickets started and the wind slowed down. And now that silence had been replaced by something else entirely, a relentless wall of noise that seemed to grow louder the longer he tried to ignore it. He tried for a while, closing every window in the house, running a fan to create white noise, even wearing earplugs to bed, but nothing fully blocked the low thrum of bass that seemed to travel not through the air but through the ground itself, vibrating faintly beneath his floorboards. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to laughter and splashing, and the occasional shattering of a dropped glass, wondering how a life he had built so carefully could be undone so completely by a single new neighbor. During the day, things were only marginally better. Linda's landscaping crew arrived on the mornings after every party to clean the pool deck, and their equipment, leaf blowers and pressure washers, and the low growl of a truck idling in her driveway filled the hours Mark had once reserved for tending his garden in peace. His koi, once calm and unbothered, had grown skittish, darting beneath the surface at every loud noise, and Mark found himself wondering if even they could sense that something about their small, quiet world had shifted for the worse. Mark endured it for weeks before he finally approached Linda directly, choosing his words with the same care he applied to everything else in his life. He asked, politely, whether the music might be lowered after a certain hour, whether the floodlights could be angled away from his yard, whether her guests might be reminded that the fence marked the edge of someone else's private property. Linda listened with an expression of mild amusement, as though the request itself was faintly ridiculous, and when Mark finished speaking, she simply smiled and said, "This is my land, and I built exactly what I'm allowed to build. If you don't like it, that's not really my concern." The words stayed with Mark long after she walked away, not because they were cruel, but because they were so casually dismissive, as though 15 years of his labor and his peace meant nothing at all against her right to enjoy her own backyard however she pleased. Determined to resolve the matter the proper way, Mark filed a formal complaint with the Homeowners Association, laying out the noise, the lighting, the guests trespassing near his fence, and the general disruption to a quiet residential street. He expected at the very least a fair hearing. What he received instead was a swift and total dismissal. It did not take him long to understand why. Linda herself sat at the head of the association, and the board members who reviewed his complaint were, without exception, close friends of hers, people who had been invited to her pool parties and had no interest in ruling against the woman who hosted them. The official response, when it finally arrived, stated flatly that the pool had been constructed in full compliance with association guidelines and that no further action would be taken. Mark was not a man inclined to fight, but something about the unfairness of it settled into him differently than the noise or the lights ever had. He thought back on every bridge he had ever designed, every drainage system he had ever calculated down to the smallest measurement, and it struck him as almost absurd that a woman with no technical training and no patience for detail could simply declare her actions compliant and have an entire board of friends nod along without question. It was not the noise alone that bothered him anymore. It was the principle underneath it, the sense that rules only mattered when they were convenient for the people enforcing them. He decided reluctantly to consult an attorney, a decision that felt foreign to him, almost like putting on a coat that did not fit. The lawyer he hired, a sharp, methodical woman named Patricia Elms, came recommended by a former colleague who described her as someone who read contracts the way other people read novels, cover to cover, missing nothing. Patricia listened to Mark's account of the past several months without interrupting, taking notes in small, precise handwriting, and when he finished, she told him plainly that cases like his were rarely simple, but they were also rarely hopeless, provided the paperwork told a different story than the one Linda's association wanted to believe. She spent several weeks digging through public records, permits, and zoning documents related to Linda's pool construction, requesting files from the county office, cross-referencing survey maps against the association's own guidelines, and interviewing a retired zoning clerk who remembered the permit approval more clearly than anyone at the county seemed to want discussed. What she found gave Mark a small measure of hope, though not the kind he had been expecting. The permits, Patricia explained, were murky in several places. The setback requirements, the mandatory distance a structure needed to maintain from a property line, appeared to have been granted an unusual exemption, one that seemed to have been approved with suspicious speed and minimal documentation. It was the kind of irregularity that, with enough time and enough legal pressure, could potentially be challenged in court. But Patricia was honest with him about what that path would look like. Litigation over zoning exemptions could take years, cost a small fortune, and even then offered no guarantee of success. Mark, sitting across from her in a small office lined with law books, asked the question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. Was there any other way, one that did not involve years of court dates and mounting legal bills, to reclaim the peace he had lost? Patricia studied him for a long moment before she answered. There was, she said, another option, one that was entirely legal, fully within his rights as a property owner, and did not require a single lawsuit. Mark leaned forward, and for the first time since Linda's pool had gone up, something that resembled a plan began to form. Over the following weeks, Mark's property saw an unusual amount of activity, though nothing like Linda's construction crews. Trucks arrived carrying agricultural equipment, materials that looked nothing like the luxury goods that had been delivered next door. Linda, watching from her window, assumed Mark was preparing for some kind of legal battle, perhaps building a case, gathering evidence, maybe even constructing something petty out of spite that she would eventually force him to tear down through her association connections. She felt no particular concern. She had, after all, already won once. What Mark was actually doing was something far more deliberate. He applied for the proper agricultural permits, the same category of permits available to any landowner, with property zoned for small-scale farming use, a designation his land had carried since long before Linda ever arrived in the neighborhood. With those permits secured, he began construction on a composting facility, a legitimate, agricultural-grade manure and organic waste pit designed to process material from a small herd of livestock he intended to keep on his property. It was, on paper, no different from thousands of similar structures found on rural and semi-rural properties across the country. It followed every regulation. It respected every required distance from his own property line, and it was positioned, with careful, deliberate precision, exactly 5 feet from the edge of Linda's shimmering new pool. Linda still did not understand what was happening until the day the pit became operational. At first, it was only during the hottest afternoons that anyone noticed anything at all. A faint, unpleasant odor drifting across the fence line on days when the sun beat down hardest. Within a week, the smell had grown impossible to ignore. It clung to the humid summer air, thick and earthy, and completely at odds with the polished luxury of Linda's backyard oasis. Guests who once lounged for hours beside the pool now found themselves wrinkling their noses within minutes of arriving. Some made polite excuses and left early. Others complained openly, asking Linda, in front of everyone, what exactly was causing the smell. Flies began to appear in numbers that no amount of citronella candles could manage. The elegant outdoor bar, once a centerpiece of Linda's gatherings, became a place people avoided lingering near. The DJ she hired for one particular weekend event turned his music up louder and louder, as though volume alone could somehow drown out an odor, but nothing worked. Guests stopped swimming altogether. The pool, gleaming and expensive and utterly unusable in any comfortable sense, sat mostly empty while conversation at the party shifted entirely toward speculation about what on earth was happening next door. Linda tried everything she could think of to mask the problem before admitting it existed at all. She had her landscaping crew install rows of fragrant flowering shrubs along the fence line, hoping the scent might overpower whatever drifted over from Mark's side. She purchased industrial-strength outdoor air fresheners, the kind normally used in commercial kitchens, and had them mounted discreetly around the pool deck. She even considered, for a brief and increasingly desperate afternoon, hiring a company to spray a chemical neutralizing agent directly onto her own property, though her attorney warned her that doing so without understanding the composting regulations on Mark's side of the fence could create legal complications of its own. Nothing worked. The smell was not something that could be perfumed away, and the harder Linda tried to hide it, the more obvious her efforts became to everyone attending her parties. It did not take long for someone to figure it out, and even less time for someone to record it. A guest at one of Linda's parties filmed a short video panning slowly from the sparkling infinity edge of the pool to the plain, functional composting pit sitting quietly on the other side of the fence, captioning it with a simple, mocking phrase describing a luxury pool built directly beside a working manure pit. The video spread through the community with startling speed, passed from phone to phone, shared in group chats, and forwarded between neighbors who had never even met Mark or Linda but found the situation too absurd not to talk about. Local news outlets in nearby towns picked up the story within days, framing it as a lighthearted tale of neighborly justice, complete with interviews of residents who had long grumbled about Linda's parties, but never found the courage to say so publicly. Within days, it seemed as though everyone in town had heard the story, and the mansion that Linda had once shown off with such pride had become, almost overnight, a punchline repeated at grocery stores, barber shops, and dinner tables across the county. It did not take long for someone to figure it out, and even less time for someone to record it. A guest at one of Linda's parties filmed a short video panning slowly from the sparkling infinity edge of the pool to the plain, functional composting pit sitting quietly on the other side of the fence, captioning it with a simple, mocking phrase describing a luxury pool built directly beside a working manure pit. The video spread through the community with startling speed, passed from phone to phone, shared in group chats, and forwarded between neighbors who had never even met Mark or Linda but found the situation too absurd not to talk about. Within days, It seemed as though everyone in town had heard the story, and the mansion that Linda had once shown off with such pride had become, almost overnight, a punchline. Linda's fury was immediate, and for the first time since Mark had met her, visibly unguarded. She called the homeowners association demanding immediate action, but there was nothing the association could do. The pit sat entirely within Mark's property, built under a completely different set of agricultural regulations than the residential guidelines the association governed. She called the local police department, insisting that Mark be forced to remove what she described as a public nuisance, but officers who visited the property found no violation of any ordinance. She contacted the environmental inspector's office, hoping an odor complaint might carry weight, but the inspection confirmed that the composting facility met every required standard for waste management and distance from neighboring structures. She even brought in a building inspector to search for some flaw, some technicality Mark might have overlooked in his rush to construct the pit, but the inspector's report came back the same as everything before it. Fully compliant. No violations found. Linda hired an attorney of her own, a sharp-suited man named Gregory Halston who had built his reputation representing developers in zoning disputes across the state, and who assured her within their first meeting that a matter this straightforward would be resolved within weeks. That confidence began to erode almost immediately. Gregory reviewed every document related to Mark's pit with growing frustration, as he found, page after page, that everything had been done correctly. Every permit was in order. Every setback measurement matched exactly what regulations required. Every piece of paperwork had been filed months in advance, long before Linda's pool had ever produced its first ripple. He requested an emergency injunction from a county judge, arguing that the composting facility constituted a deliberate nuisance designed purely to harass a neighbor, but the judge, after reviewing the same documents Gregory had already studied, found no legal basis to intervene. The pit was agricultural. The land was zoned to allow it. The distances satisfied every requirement. Whatever Mark's intentions might have been, intention was not something the law could regulate when every action taken had followed the rules to the letter. For the first time since she had moved into the neighborhood, Linda began to understand something uncomfortable. Mark had not built this pit out of anger or impulse. He had planned it, quietly and meticulously. For months, the same patient precision he had once applied to bridges and drainage systems now turned towards something far more personal. She thought back to the conversation on her first day in the neighborhood, to the folder full of demands she had brought to his door, to the dismissive way she had told him it was her land to do with as she pleased. It occurred to her, uncomfortably, that Mark might have been telling her the very same thing all along, simply in a language that had taken her months to understand. As Linda scrambled to find some way to reverse her situation, cracks began to appear elsewhere in her carefully constructed image. A member of the homeowners association, someone who had grown tired of watching Linda wield her position like a weapon, came forward anonymously with a list of grievances that had been quietly building for years. There were stories of neighbors forced to tear down storage sheds that violated rules Linda herself had bent for her own property. There were accounts of elderly homeowners pressured into expensive roof replacements over minor cosmetic disagreements, threatened with fines they could not afford. There were whispered stories of favoritism, of fines waived for Linda's friends while others were penalized for far smaller infractions. A local reporter named Susan Fairweather, catching wind of both the viral video and the growing dissatisfaction within the neighborhood, began digging into Linda's history as association president. She spent 2 weeks interviewing residents who had been reluctant to speak publicly before, filing public records, requests for association, meeting minutes, and comparing fine notices issued to ordinary homeowners against the near-total absence of fines issued to Linda herself. What she uncovered painted a picture entirely different from the image Linda had cultivated. Records showed repeated instances where Linda had overlooked violations on her own property that would have resulted in immediate fines for anyone else: an unpermitted outdoor kitchen, a fence height that technically exceeded the association's own limit, decorative lighting installed without the required approval process every other homeowner had been forced to endure. The story, once published under a headline that drew immediate attention across the county, spread almost as quickly as the video had, and what had started as an amusing piece of neighborhood gossip transformed into something far more damaging to Linda's reputation. Elderly residents who had quietly resented being forced into expensive roof replacements over minor cosmetic disagreements finally felt emboldened to speak up. A young couple who had been fined heavily for a storage shed that barely differed from Linda's own garden structure came forward with photographs proving the double standard. One after another, stories that had been swallowed for years out of fear or exhaustion began surfacing, each one adding weight to a growing sense among residents that Linda's leadership had never truly served the community at all, only her own comfort and convenience. The following association meeting was unlike any the neighborhood had seen before. What was normally a quiet, sparsely attended gathering became standing room only, residents packing into the small community hall, many of them holding printed copies of the news article, others simply eager to speak about their own experiences with Linda's leadership. Folding chairs were brought in from a storage closet, and still could not accommodate everyone who showed up, several residents choosing to stand along the back wall rather than miss what was clearly going to be an important night. The meeting devolved into something closer to a public reckoning, neighbor after neighbor standing to share stories of unfair treatment, favoritism, and quiet intimidation that had gone unspoken for years. Linda attempted, more than once, to regain control of the room the way she always had, raising her voice, invoking procedure, reminding everyone that she had personally funded several community projects, but the goodwill those gestures had once purchased was long gone. By the time a formal vote of no confidence was called, the outcome was hardly in question. Linda was removed from her position as president by an overwhelming majority, stripped of the authority she had used so freely against people like Mark. Without the protective shield of her position, Linda found herself facing consequences she had never anticipated. The pool that had once been the pride of her backyard now sat largely unused, its water clean but its reputation permanently tainted by the story that had spread across the entire town. Desperate to salvage something from the situation, Linda attempted to sell the mansion, listing it with a real estate agent who initially seemed confident about a quick, profitable sale given the size and quality of the home itself. That confidence did not last. The agent scheduled showing after showing, and each one seemed to follow the same disheartening pattern. Prospective buyers who toured the property often asked, almost immediately, about the strange smell that lingered near the backyard on warmer days, and more than one buyer recognized the property from the video that had circulated so widely months earlier, some of them even laughing openly as they connected the elegant pool in front of them to the story they had seen shared online. One family, midway through what had seemed like a promising tour, simply thanked the agent politely and left the moment they realized which house they were standing in. Another buyer joked, within earshot of Linda herself, that he would need to factor the cost of a very good fence into his offer, just to avoid the same fate. The agent, after several failed showings, finally sat Linda down and delivered the news as gently as he could manage. The pool itself was beautiful, he admitted, genuinely one of the finest private installations he had seen in the area, the kind of feature that would normally add significant value to any listing. But nobody wanted to buy a house people would forever associate with a manure pit. The story had become the property's defining feature, and no amount of landscaping or staging seemed able to erase it from the mind of anyone who had heard the tale. He suggested delicately that she might need to lower the asking price substantially if she hoped to attract any serious interest at all, a suggestion that landed on Linda like one final, humiliating blow after months of steadily accumulating losses. With her reputation damaged, her position gone, and her home now nearly impossible to sell, Linda made the decision to hire a professional odor remediation company, hoping that eliminating the smell entirely might restore at least some value to the property. The costs mounted quickly, month after month of specialized treatments and consultations that drained far more money than she had anticipated, all while the pool sat empty and the mansion remained on the market with no serious offers in sight. It was in this state, humbled in a way she had never experienced before, that Linda finally walked across the shared property line and knocked on Mark's front door, not with a folder full of demands this time, but with nothing in her hands at all. Mark opened the door and, for a long moment, simply looked at her, waiting to see what version of Linda had come to speak with him. It was not the version he had grown accustomed to. Gone was the tailored confidence, the folder full of demands, the certainty that had once seemed to radiate from every word she spoke. She stood on his porch looking smaller somehow, dressed simply, her hands clasped in front of her in a way that suggested she had rehearsed this moment several times without ever quite settling on what to say. He invited her inside, more out of habit than warmth, and poured 2 cups of coffee at the small kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast alone for 15 years. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried none of the sharp confidence that had once defined every interaction between them. She admitted, slowly, and with visible discomfort, that she had misused her authority as association president. She admitted that she had treated the property line as though it existed only to benefit her, never once considering what building directly beside Mark's home would cost him in terms of peace and comfort. She admitted, perhaps most difficult of all for a woman who had spent her life believing money solved every problem, that she had assumed her wealth and position made her untouchable, and that assumption had cost her everything she had worked to build. She spoke, too, about the months since the video had spread, about the isolation of losing the position she had built her identity around, about sitting alone beside a pool nobody wanted to swim in anymore, while the phone stopped ringing with invitations she once took for granted. It was not, she admitted, the financial loss that had hurt the most, though the financial loss had certainly been significant. It was the quiet realization that she had spent years surrounded by people who admired her influence rather than her character, and that once the influence disappeared, so did most of them. Mark listened to all of it without interrupting, the same patient quality that had defined him since the very beginning of their conflict. When she finished, he offered only a simple response, one that carried far more weight than any legal argument or angry confrontation ever could have. He told her that he had never wanted to win anything from her. He had never wanted a fight, never wanted headlines or viral videos or public humiliation. All he had ever wanted, from the very first day her construction trucks arrived, was to be left in peace on the land he had spent 15 years building with his own hands. The two of them, over the following weeks, worked out a formal agreement, one drafted carefully by attorneys from both sides to ensure it would hold, regardless of how their relationship might evolve or deteriorate in the future. Patricia Elms represented Mark once again, and this time Gregory Halston, having watched every one of his earlier arguments collapse under the weight of Mark's meticulous preparation, approached the negotiation with none of the aggressive posturing he had once brought to the courtroom. Linda agreed to remove the outdoor sound system entirely, dismantling the speakers that had once carried music deep into Mark's quiet evenings. She agreed to plant a dense line of trees along her side of the property, tall enough to block direct sight lines into Mark's backyard and soften the visual intrusion the pool had created, selecting the same species of maple and oak that already grew along Mark's side of the fence so that, in time, the two lines of trees might grow to look like a single continuous barrier rather than two competing properties. She agreed to limit gatherings to reasonable hours and reasonable noise levels, terms that were now written into a binding civil agreement rather than left to her discretion, with specific cutoff times and decibel limits spelled out in language precise enough to leave no room for the kind of interpretation she had once relied on so freely. She also agreed to reconfigure a portion of the pool deck, pulling certain structures back to maintain a respectful distance from the shared property line, a distance she had ignored so casually when she first built it. The renovation cost her nearly as much as the original construction had, a final expense that seemed, to anyone who heard the story afterward, like a fitting closing chapter to the entire affair. Once the agreement was signed, something quietly shifted between the two neighbors. It did not happen quickly, and it was never anything resembling friendship, but a kind of cautious civility settled over the property line that had once divided them so bitterly. Linda began waving politely when she saw Mark tending his garden, and occasionally, on quieter evenings, the two exchanged brief conversations across the fence about nothing more important than the weather or the health of his tomato plants. It was not forgiveness in any deep or dramatic sense, simply the slow, ordinary process of two people learning to coexist after having caused each other considerable harm. Once every term of the agreement had been finalized and signed, Mark did something that surprised even himself. He decommissioned the composting pit, the very structure that had brought Linda's world crashing down around her. He filled it in carefully, restored the soil, and within a season had returned that section of his land to garden beds, planting new rows of vegetables in the very spot where, for a brief and strange period, chaos had bloomed instead. The koi pond, the maple trees, the cedar fences, all of it slowly returned to the way it had been before the mansion next door changed hands, before floodlights and baselines and strangers leaning over his fence had disrupted the quiet life he had built. The story of the pool and the pit became something of a local legend, retold at dinner tables and neighborhood gatherings for years afterward, sometimes with exaggeration, sometimes with careful accuracy, but always with the same underlying lesson at its heart. Newcomers to the association meetings occasionally heard older residents reference it as shorthand whenever a new dispute arose, a gentle warning against the kind of overreach that had once cost Linda so dearly. The association itself changed under new leadership, a quieter, more measured couple who made a point of reviewing every complaint fairly, regardless of who filed it or who it concerned, and residents often joked that the entire culture of the neighborhood had shifted the moment Linda's pool met Mark's pit. Property lines, people came to understand, were never simply about surveyed distances or legal boundaries drawn on official maps. They were about respect, about the quiet understanding that another person's peace mattered just as much as one's own comfort, regardless of how much money or influence stood behind a decision. Patricia Elms, in the years that followed, occasionally referenced the case when mentoring younger attorneys, using it as an example of how patience and precision could accomplish more than aggression ever could, a reminder that the law rewarded those who respected its details rather than those who assumed themselves above them. For Mark, the entire ordeal reaffirmed something he had believed, long before Linda ever moved in next door. Patience, when paired with careful preparation, could accomplish what anger and confrontation never could. He had never raised his voice. He had never filed a single lawsuit. He had simply followed every rule, secured every permit, and let the natural consequences of Linda's own decisions unfold exactly as the law allowed them to. The peace he reclaimed felt more meaningful because of how it had been won, not through domination or revenge, but through quiet persistence and an unwavering respect for what was rightfully his. For Linda, the lesson arrived at a far steeper cost. She had spent years assuming that authority and wealth placed her above the concerns of ordinary neighbors, that rules existed for other people, while exceptions existed for her. It took the loss of her position, the near loss of her property value, and months of humiliation before she finally understood what Mark had known from the very beginning, that true security in a community came not from control, but from consideration. Years later, when new families moved into the neighborhood and heard the old story for the first time, they would often walk past Mark's property and glance toward the fence line where, according to legend, a pool and a pit had once stood only 5 feet apart. By then, there was nothing unusual to see, only a well-tended garden, a quiet koi pond, and cedar fencing weathered gracefully by time. The mansion next door still stood, its pool restored to something more modest and far more private than before, its parties now smaller, quieter affairs that respected the invisible line separating one home's happiness from another's. And Mark, older now but no less devoted to the quiet life he had built, still sat on his porch most evenings with a cup of coffee, listening to nothing more than wind through leaves and water moving gently over stone, exactly the way he had always wanted it.